When I built my Windows 7 gaming rig, I built it with only one Radeon HD 5850. However, I was planning on from the beginning to add a second card at some point so I could finally try out Crossfire. Well, now that I have two 5850s, I think it's time to finally try it out. But first, I need to do something else that I've been meaning to do, and that's overclock the CPU. After all, the Phenom II X4965 in here is a black edition, so it would be doing it a disservice not to overclock it. Since the CPU has an unlocked multiplier, overclocking is pretty easy, especially on a CPU this old. Basically just keep raising the multiplier, and when it eventually becomes unstable, add a little more voltage, rinse and repeat until you find the sweet spot of the chip. It is possible to overclock using the frontside bus, or as it's called on AMD systems of the time, the Hyper Transport, and while I did try that and got decent results out of it, it messed with the PCI Express speed and made the GPU unstable, and I didn't really feel like trying to sort that out since the multiplier overclock was still giving me pretty good results. I did get the system stable at 4.1 GHz, but I didn't really want to run the CPU at 1.4 volts to keep it stable, so I backed it down to 4 GHz at 1.375. That's still a 600 MHz overclock, and the benefits are obvious in something like Cinebench R15. It gained about 40 points on the multi-threaded test, bringing the score up to 400, and the single-threaded improved nicely as well, bringing the score above 100. The overclock didn't help that much for games or stuff like 3D Mark since we're being GPU bottlenecked right now, but the overclock should definitely help get the most out of the Crossfire setup. I managed to pick up another Asus HD 5850 with the DirectCU cooler on it. Now, honestly, the single HD 5850 has been serving me well. It runs most games even into 2013 pretty well. It's just that you can't max out the graphics, and that I'm using a 1680 by 1050 monitor with the system is certainly helping. Nevertheless, it'll be interesting to see how adding a second card will help the system. My second HD 5850, however, has a bit of an issue. Yeah, it has some artifacting issues. The weird thing is that the artifacts will disappear after about 10 or 15 seconds. It's almost as if the card needs to warm up a bit before it starts working correctly. And I think I know what the culprit is. If we look here at this capacitor, you can see that the silk screen underneath is very yellowed, and there's some suspicious residue around it. It's hard to believe that a product from 2010 has suffered a capacitor failure, but that appears to be the case here. I think the reason the artifacting disappears is that since the cap is bad, it takes much longer for it to charge properly, thus the temporary graphical issues. I went ahead and bought the closest spec replacement I could find, and got to town. Now, I'm not a soldering expert or anything like that, but I've done enough to get myself by in most situations. However, getting just this single cap out was a complete nightmare. The solder just did not want to melt fully, and no amount of flux, iron temp settings, and tips, or trying to add fresh solder was able to help. I even tried preheating the board with a heat gun since I thought maybe the ground plane was acting like a giant heatsink. After probably an hour's worth of work, I finally managed to pry the last leg out of the hole and get the holes free enough for me to get in the new capacitor. Of course, I was pretty worried that I may have damaged either the pads or something else on the card. Luckily, the card still posted and got to the Windows desktop just fine. However, all that work was mostly for nothing as the artifacting is still there. It does seem like it disappears a little faster than it did before, so I guess that's a win. Maybe the cheap no-name replacement caps I got just suck, which is very likely, or maybe the other caps nearby are also bad. Either way, I don't really care since the card works fine after the initial few seconds, so I'll just deal with this whenever the card breaks fully, and then I have to actually worry about it. According to the manual for the motherboard, the two white slots are full PCIe 2.0 by 16, while the red ones are only by 8. I decided to try out the cards in both white slots, first to see what the best case scenario would be in terms of bandwidth, and then tried it out with the second card moved down to a red slot. Having the cards so close together does aesthetically look very nice, but predictably, the top card ran very hot, about 15 degrees or more hotter than it was before. The performance didn't really seem to be affected by moving the second card down to the lower slot, so I'm just going to leave it in the second config since the temps are so much better. Cinebench doesn't seem to take advantage of a second GPU. In fact, it was actually slightly slower, having lost 2 FPS with the second card added. Unigine Heaven crashed on me a couple different times and produced severe glitching. Whether or not this is related to the artifacting, I'm unsure of, but the performance has greatly improved, going from an average of 17 FPS on DX11 Ultra with no AA to an average of 32.1 FPS. That's an improvement of 88%, which is certainly not bad. 3D Mark Vantage, set to Extreme, again shows a big performance increase, albeit not as big as you might expect, only increasing by 77%. Still, not a bad improvement in the slightest. Interestingly, 3D Mark 11, also on the highest preset, shows better scaling than Vantage, with an impressive 91% improvement. Maybe it's better optimized, or DX11 takes better advantage of multi-GPUs. Tomb Raider 2013, running the built-in benchmark at 1080p with the high preset, gives us an average of 64.9 FPS on a single card. Not bad by any means, but with Crossfire the score jumps to 125 FPS average, a pretty impressive 94% increase. I wasn't expecting this game to scale so well, but it's certainly a welcome surprise. Although when I was playing the introduction of Tomb Raider, the system actually locked up on me. I wasn't recording it, unfortunately, but there definitely seems to be more and more stability issues with the second card in there, and I'm starting to suspect that it's the likely culprit. And finally, since I don't have many games on here with built-in benchmarks, Stalker Call of Pripyat. This was ran at 1080p, fully maxed out, and we can see impressive improvements in the average FPS of all the tests. The benchmark did seem to have quite a few stutters, but I'm not very familiar with this benchmark, so that may just be normal for it. So the performance in terms of FPS and synthetic scores is much higher, as to be expected, but the real killer of multi-GPU setups is frame pacing. Having bad and inconsistent frame times is common on Crossfire and SLI, but is this system experiencing them? Well, at least from my very scientific how does it feel test, it doesn't seem that bad. Since everything is pretty much running well over 60 FPS, it starts to become harder to tell, at least for me personally, but it doesn't seem that awful or anything. I know it's not very scientific, and the fact I don't have a wide variety of games that even need the extra performance Crossfire offers isn't really helping make this experiment any more flushed out. I know I probably should be looking at a proper frame time graph and everything for these tests, but I just don't really want to. But that's kind of the main point of this, is just experimentation. I can now say that I have experienced Crossfire. I think if my second 5850 wasn't so screwed up, I'd be having a better experience with it, but even in its screwed up state, it isn't that bad. I think the better direction for this system is going to be putting in a faster single card. I already have a couple on hand that I want to try, so I'll probably be benchmarking those in a future video, and we'll be comparing them to the Crossfire setup and the single 5850. This CPU should still have a little more to give in terms of performance, and maybe by then I'll have a few more intensive games to try out. Hopefully you guys liked the video, and if you have any other suggestions regarding what I could do with the Crossfire setup or just the Windows 7 machine in general, be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.